Get started. So to introduce myself to those of you that are new to us, I'm Karen Albert. I'm the director of the Hofstra University Museum of Art. Since the pandemic, we started doing a series of programs called Second Fridays. And it was the second Friday of every month at 3 o'clock. We did a program about our permanent collection. So this series is a little bit different. This is a series that's going to be 5 sessions every Friday for 5 weeks. So it goes starting today through March 4th at 3 p.m. They're all going to be held in the same Zoom link. So the same Zoom link that you used to enter today, you'll have for all the sessions. And what I typically do is the morning of the event, I'll resend the confirmation email, so you'll have the Zoom link that day. So if you lose it sometime in between, so you'll be able to join us again. I do ask that you keep your microphones on mute until the end of the presentation, and there's be plenty of time for question and answer at the end. If you have questions, you can certainly put them in the chat as we go. And this program is being recorded, just so for your information. So this program is a series of 5 that is going to give you a little bit more of an in-depth look at Romare Bearden's work. Usually when we've been doing these programs, we focus on either one aspect of our collection or one artist, and that's it. That's all you get. And we thought, let's dig a little deeper. Let's investigate a little farther than we can, in half an hour, 45 minutes. So this is a way to kind of think about Romare Bearden in a lot of different ways. So the first session, as I said, is today. So today we're going to talk about, we've titled it A Treasured Gift, Romare Bearden's Art in the Museum's Collection. So we're going to talk a little bit about today is the works that are in our collection that we own here at Hofstra, and who the donors were who gave them to us and why we kind of have these here. And a little bit about, and then a little biography about who Romare Bearden was. So it's not going to be a lot about his art. There'll be some talk about his art, of course, but this is more about kind of a little bit more about him and what his biography is. Then next week, session 2 on February 11th, we're going to talk very specifically about the works that are in our collection. Talk about some of the influences, how his personal experience, relates to the work. That'll be a little bit more in depth about the individual works of art. And then we have we're very excited for this collaboration with the EFA Robert Blackburn Studio in New York. They're going to give us a virtual printmaking demonstration. So we'll see how it's made. Because very often when we're talking about printmaking, people have questions about how it's made, and it's hard to kind of explain and describe. So they're going to actually give us a little demo. So we'll be able to learn a little bit about how the process was. And I think it'll give you a greater understanding about how they're made and how very labor intensive and really complicated it can be. So I think that'll be we're very excited for that. And then the 4th session is actually an art activity, an art making session about collage. So we're giving you here at the beginning a little list of supplies that you might want to gather before that session. And we'll remind you of this each week as we go along. But then one of our museum educators is going to lead us in a little art making activity about collage. Sasha, we were going to post the list in the chat. So if anybody wanted the list in the chat, so if you could do that for me. So then we could, just in case you wanted a reminder about what to do. And then the last session on March 4th, we're kind of going to do a little summary and a recap and answer any lingering questions you might have or conversations you want to have about specific items. So that's kind of a recap about what the sessions are going to be. So now I'm going to talk a little bit now about the permanent collection at the Hofstra University Museum of Art. So our collection contains more than 5,000 works of art. It ranges from American and European drawings, paintings, photographs, print, sculpture, and other media. It also includes work of African, Asian, Melanesian, Central, and South American artifacts. About 44% of our collection is prints. And the Romare Bearden works in our collections are all prints, just to be clear. So we have 27 prints in our collection that were done by Bearden, and they include a variety of printmaking types. They're lithograph, screen prints, and engravings. And Bearden was very much involved. He was very hands-on in his process, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. And he often combined different types of printmaking methods with each other because he really wanted to capture the look of collage, which is most of his, individual works are, whereas prints are multiple. He wanted to capture that look of collage in a print. And in order to do that, he kind of had to make up the method because it really didn't exist before. So in 2018, we did an exhibition in our Emily Lowe Gallery of 22 of the works by Romare Bearden from our collection. So those are just a couple gallery shots from that 2018 exhibition to give you some idea of how they look together. Right? So the works in our permanent collection are all donated. We do not have an acquisition fund. So there are two major donors to the Romare Bearden works in our collection. One is Carol and Alex Rosenberg, and the other is Dr. Dorothy Cohn and then her son Richard Cohn. So Carol and Alex Rosenberg gave us 19 of the works in our collection, among many other works that they've given us over the years. Alex Rosenberg is a print publisher and art dealer, and he worked with Romare Bearden and Bob Blackburn in 1973 on this print that you see here called The Train. He also worked on, and I'll show it in a moment, another one called The Family. So because Alex was the print publisher, he had access to, he worked with Romare on these very frequently. And we have a very unique aspect of the prints in our collection is that we have multiples of the same print. That Romare Bearden was known for what we would call pulling a print off the press and then manipulating it and doing, like, he'd take it back to his studio and he'd do watercolor, he'd do collage on it. So we have prints that are technically multiples, but they're really unique artworks because they weren't not done in a multiple. And this is the series called The Family. So the image you see in the center, and I have a larger picture of it next, but is the actual final print that was what we call edition, that they were made multiple copies of. The four surrounding it are all various stages to get to that final stage. And this is a very unique aspect of our collection, that we have all of these kind of states of the print leading up to the final. And that's because of that's the print publisher, Alex Rosenberg, had these and donated them to us. On a couple of the prints, you can see little notations about, this is a good color, I need more blue here. So it's really, really helps you to see kind of the working process of the artist. So these are a couple larger scale images of The Family on your left and The Train on your right, to give you a view of what they look like. So these are prints, these are multiples, but they look very much like collage, and that's what Romare Bearden was going for. He wanted to capture that idea of collage in his printmaking. Okay, so then the other major donor to our collection, this is a print called Homage to Mary Lou, the Piano Lesson, and this was given to us by Dr. Dorothy Cohn, who was a professor of marketing here at Hofstra in the School of Business. And she was a collector of Bearden's work. So she had donated this to us in 1991. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later. So, and then after she passed away in 1999, and she had 6 screen prints that were in her campus office, all related to the Odysseus suite. initially, the family asked us, could we hold on to them? Because they didn't want to just leave the prince in her office unattended. So we said, yeah, sure, we'll hold on to them for the moment while they were settling the estate. And then her son, Richard Cohn, said, we would like to donate them to the museum. So that because of her being here at Hofstra and her relationship to the university, we then ended up with 6 of the prints from the Odysseus Suite series. So this is just one. This is the Fall of Troy. It's one of the series. So that's kind of the way they came to us and why we have what we have. So I'm going to talk now a little bit more about Bearden's biography. So Bearden was a visual artist, an author, and a songwriter who drew from his personal experience to illustrate the broader experience of Black Americans, telling stories that connected the past to the 20th century. Delving into his personal experiences for insight and drawing on his deep knowledge of history, literature, and music, Bearden merged his artistic expression with his cultural heritage to provide a social commentary. So he was born on September 2nd in 1911 in Charlotte, North Carolina, and he passed away on March 12th in 1988 in New York City. His friends always called him Romy. Romy, that was his nickname, Romy. So he was born into the middle class. His parents, Bessie and Howard, were both college educated. And Bearden's grandparents were property owners, both his family in North Carolina and his family in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And in the early 20th century, this was relatively unusual for the family to own property in both places, especially in the South where the Jim Crow laws were still in effect, were still actively being in effect. So his family moved from North Carolina to New York City in 1914. They settled in Harlem in 1920. Bearden's father worked as a sanitation inspector for the New York City Health Department, and he was also a pianist, which helped to shape his son's lifelong involvement with music. Bessie Bearden was more of a social activist. She worked as the New York correspondent for the Chicago Defender, which was one of the most influential African-American newspapers in the country at the time. So the family home in Harlem was a meeting place for many artists and writers of what became known as the Harlem Renaissance. Based primarily in that neighborhood during the 1920s, the Harlem Renaissance witnessed a resurgence of art, dance, literature, and music by Black Americans, including such notable figures as Aaron Douglas, W.E.B. Du Bois, Duke Ellington, Langston Hughes, Paul Robeson, Augusta Savage, and Charles White. And this was a valuable foundation for Bearden in the literature and music that remained with him throughout his lifetime. So these figures that were prominent figures, especially in the arts and literature, he knew these people. They visited his home. It was part of his daily life. So obviously had a strong impact on him. He routinely visited North Carolina to see family and friends. Charlotte was a railroad hub connecting different lines. And for Bearden, trains were an important presence in the rural South, as they connected families and transported them in many directions. The idea of the train references both everyday life, as the trains followed a schedule and the 5:10 freight train came by every day at 5:10, that kind of thing. And also the larger ideas about migration and segregation. Beginning in the early 20th century, there was a movement of Black Americans known as the Great Migration from the rural South to the industrialized cities of the Northeast and the Midwest. Often traveling by train, these people sought better jobs and living conditions. So it was a very common thing to travel by train and be going back and forth from north to south. So the train as an idea of connection and of exploring is a symbol that Bearden frequently used in his work, including the whole series that we have called The Train. He also frequently visited his other grandparents in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So in the 1920s, he started spending summers with his maternal grandparents, who owned a boarding house. And it was in Pittsburgh that he really started to draw. That was when, where he really started to observe his surroundings and draw. So he was influenced, as I said, by trains, by roosters, cats, and barns, and shingled shacks that reflected the rural landscape of his childhood. And in the summer of 1927, he worked the night shift at U.S. Steel. And he later wrote about the kind of working conditions that he encountered there, particularly for the Black Americans working there, and the discrimination that they faced, regardless of whether they were a membership in the union or not. So it's a kind of an ongoing awareness of his. Bearden completed his formal education in 1935. He earned a degree in education from New York University. While working as a caseworker for the New York City Department of Social Work, where he worked until he retired in 1969, he continued to study art, including time at the Art Students League with the artist George Gross. The image on your upper right is a George Gross painting from our collection. And he had his first solo exhibition in 1940. He served in the U.S. Army during World War II, and with the assistance from the GI Bill, in 1950, Bearden traveled to Paris, where he studied art and philosophy at the Sorbonne. He began friendships with James Baldwin and Richard Wright, and interacted with many European artists, such as Constantine Brancusi and Georges Braque. He was very influenced by the modernist ideas of Cubist space and Fauvist color. When he returned to the US, he continued to work in the visual arts along with songwriting. And in 1961, he began a long-standing relationship with the Cordier and Ekstrom Gallery in New York City. And since the 1960s, his work has been exhibited at galleries and art institutions nationally and internationally, culminating in a retrospective exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1971. In 1954, he married Nanette Rohan, who was a dancer and choreographer. She was born in Staten Island, but her family had roots in the Caribbean and St. Martin. So in 1973, they built a house in the Caribbean and began to spend half their time in the Caribbean and half their time in New York. And from the Caribbean, he gets inspired by what are called conjure women, or the Obeah women, who were the women who prepared the potions and the herbal remedies and counseled families. And these type of women and their and their tradition has roots in African tribal culture. So that African ethnic culture. So that kind of goes back to the idea of the herbalist women. It kind of goes back to that. So so obviously when he goes to the Caribbean, he gets very influenced by the light and the color that you see in the Caribbean versus New York. And I think when I showed you the series about Troy, some of those you really feel the Caribbean color in. On occasion, Bearden created print editions to raise funds for his wife's dance company, the Nanette Bearden Contemporary Dance Theater, as he did with this print, Homage to Mary Lou, the Piano Lesson. Now, this is a lithograph, so it's a print, it's a multiple, that was based on a collage that he did titled The Piano Lesson. And it was one of the many works that Bearden completed with the theme of memory and music. Music frequently comes back again and again in his work. And the influence of music, particularly blues and jazz, were the main ones that he refers to himself. He thought of jazz as a metaphor for the energy and pulse of life. So that was very important to him. He also had a lot of conversations with Stuart Davis about the idea of jazz. And they talked about this idea of music and connecting it with the visual arts. So Stuart Davis was the one that encouraged Bearden to listen to Earl Hines playing the piano. And Davis said of this, I listened for hours to recordings of Earl Hines at the piano. Finally, I was able to concentrate on the silences between the notes. I found this was very helpful to me in the transmutation of sound into colors and the placement of objects in my paintings and collages. So very much the sound between the notes, I see that in visual art, we talk about positive and negative space, right? The things that are in the foreground and the things that are falling back. So it's that same idea that there's, you know, there's a pacing and there's a different space between the different aspects. So I think that was a very much what Bearden, what they were, some of the things they would talk about when we talk about the influence of jazz, not just some of the imagery, but also the way the composition is created, that it moves you along on a different pace. Bearden was also very involved in trying to promote and help other artists, particularly artists of color. So this, along with artists Charles Alston, Norman Lewis, and Hal Woodruff, he was a founding member of the Spiral Group. The Spiral Group was a Black artist collective active between 1963 and 65 in New York City, and the group was examining the relationship between art and social activism. The group's name referred to the Archimedean Spiral, which moves from a starting point outward in all directions, but continues to move forward. And I think that analogy really goes to what they were trying to do, because the group did not have a common artistic style, but rather they encouraged experimentation and individualistic approaches. One of the issues they debated was whether a figurative style or a more radical abstraction was more effective to illustrate Black experience. So the idea that they didn't all have to create art the same way or look the same, but they were all moving in the same direction. That's kind of what they were talking about. And there was a certain amount of activism as far as bringing awareness to what was happening. Although active only for a brief time, the Spiral Group encouraged discussions about such issues as philosophy, creativity, and artistic freedom, especially as they addressed the artist's role in social change. And after the March on Washington in 1963, the meetings took on an even more activist role. They wanted to be part of that civil rights movement through their artwork, through their work. That was part of something that they wanted to do. So Bearden was very often at the forefront of helping other artists. He was one of the founding founders of the Studio Museum in Harlem in 1968. In 1969, he co-founded the Cinque Gallery, which is named after the leader in the Amistad Mutiny of 1839, and dedicated it to young minority artists in need of exhibition space. And reading more about Bearden, one of the things is that everybody always said how generous he was with his time, with helping people, with lifting other people up. And I think that was just part of who he was. So for those of you who don't know, the Amistad Mutiny was a rebellion of enslaved people on board a ship near the coast of Cuba. The mutineers were captured and tried in the United States, which ended up at the end resulted in a victory for abolitionists and anti-slavery forces in 1841 when the U.S. Supreme Court freed them. So it's a long story, but it's a very interesting one. There was a movie about it, so you may have heard about what the Amistad was, but that's a brief reason. So that's what they had. The Cinque was the leader of the Amistad Rebellion. So that's kind of that idea of bringing that past into what he's doing now in the 20th century. In addition, Bearden also authored many scholarly articles. A couple are A Painter's Mind, a study of the relations of structure and space in painting, along with painter Carl Holty. And very importantly, A History of African-American Artists from 1972 to the present, with the journalist Harry Henderson, which was published posthumously in 1993. One of the things you may have, if you follow the art world a little bit, you may have heard a lot of things about what they call the art historical canon. the history of art as it's recorded in, like, you may remember the Jansen's history of art. At the time, a lot of African American artists were not included in that book. So that idea that if you're not included in what the written textbook is that says the history of art, then you're almost not there. So a lot of work has been done to include not just people of color, but gender and other, other races too, of people who were kind of, if you weren't part of that American, European, New York City centric group, sometimes you got left out of the writing. And part of this idea of creating a history of African American artists was to bring people awareness to the other artists. So this is what I mean by Bearden being very generous and outreaching. He wanted to help everybody else reach an acclaim, because he had a retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art in 1971. That was relatively early for a Black artist to have a one-person show there. So he really thought about, what can I do with, now that I've been getting a name for myself, what can I do to help other people? How can I help other artists of color to reach forward and together? So I think that was one of the things that he very intentionally did. So Bearden was also influenced by traditional African art, particularly masks. On the left side are some examples of African masks from our collection. And on the right is a photostat, or like a Xerox copy, of some African masks from his records. And one of the things that he liked to do, he liked to use the black and white imagery.
Karen, I think we lost the sound. Can everybody else hear her?
Oh, I'm sorry, my microphone just got out.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I see.
Okay.
Nodding. Yes.
All of a sudden my microphone cut out. Where did I cut out at?
You were saying just the very beginning of the African mask, and that he was influenced by this.
Oh, okay. I'll go back and repeat myself. Sorry. All of a sudden I got a pop-up saying my microphone failed. So he was very influenced by traditional African art, particularly the masks. On the left are 3 examples from our permanent collection of some different African masks that we have. On the right is a photostat, which is kind of like a Xerox, a black and white, of some African masks. This is from something from his records. He frequently used the black and white imagery and in his collages. That's something you'll see again. He also liked to use the Xeroxes or photostats because he would enlarge certain aspects of the mask for a collage. So if he was using it for the head of somebody, he might make the head larger or smaller compared to the body. So he liked that ability to change the what do you call it? Change the proportion of something. He also would be able to pick out a part of an image that he wanted to include, not necessarily the full image. So using the copies allowed him to really manipulate the imagery. So, Romare Bearden was a prolific artist who experimented with different mediums and artistic approaches before focusing on his collage style. The collage technique allowed him to densely layer many references and creating overlapping meanings. His experiments in printmaking broke new ground, allowing him to recreate his imagery in multiples and make his work available for a wider audience. Bearden created art that related to his personal journeys with those of universal heroes and connected them with his experience. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize my video had popped out either. So I'd be happy to talk some more about some of these different issues about his life, about what his attitude towards some of these things were. I don't know. Sasha was gonna. If you have a question, you can put it in the chat. If you'd like to raise your hand.
So no questions yet, but please feel
Okay.
free to, like Karen said, either raise your hand or put a question in the chat. And if you scroll up in the chat, there is the PDF with the book list that was put together by Hempstead Library for us, which is a great resource.
Oh,
So
thank you.
I
Yeah.
wanted to point that out as well. So
Yeah.
any questions, please feel free.
But the next session we'll talk more about specific artworks and specific relationships, but wanted to give you a little bit of understanding of who he was, where he came from. You're talking about somebody who grew up starting with Jim Crow in the South, came to New York City, was involved in the civil rights movement. So all of these things had influence on what he was doing. And although he personally had was quite successful in his life, he often, reached a hand back and helped other people come up, and he's very conscious of the idea that, of being part of a community that needed more exposure and more resources.
A good question from Ron Jansen, Karen.
Yeah.
How about his critical reputation? Has it consistently been positive from the start?
As far as I know, yes. He was very well received. The fact that he had a retrospective at Museum of Modern Art in 1971, I think tells you how much critical acclaim he did have. That was not, I don't think, I think that was very important. I think that one of the things he also does, and I talk about this a little bit, we talk specifically about his art, but he really brought the idea of collage up a level in fine art. A lot of artists did collage work. I mean, going back to like Picasso and George Braque, they did collage work. Collage was not something he created, but he really took it on as his method of communicating. And I think a lot of what he loved to do was create these layers of meaning and using these different references. And that the collage really lent itself to that. So he really elevated the use of collage, I think, is one of the things that he's really well known for. And the prints that he did, he wanted them to look like his collages. He wanted them to look similar, but he wanted it to be so, he could make 100 prints and more people could see his imagery, more people could see his work, because prints are multiples, whereas a collage would be a one-of-a-kind individual piece. But if you make a print of it, and you print 100 of them, then you can, not only is it, business-wise good because you get to sell more works, but your image and your ideas get out there and reach more people, and reach people at a lower level, because prints are generally less expensive than in one of a kind work.
Karen, that series on the trains and the family,
Yes.
are those unique because they are different prints?
Well, the ones we have in our collection are mostly unique because most of them, Bearden was always playing around with the imagery. So he would, and when you're doing a print, and I think you'll see it when we do the print demo in a couple weeks, when you're working on a print, at some point you do what they call like a proof. You run it through the printing press to see what it looks like, right? Because you can't always tell exactly. So he would run it off, and then he'd take that print back to his studio, and he'd color it, and he'd do washes, and he'd do other things to it, and he'd work on the print again. So a lot of the ones in are actually unique images because they have a lot of hand watercolor and hand coloring. Some of them have additional collage on them. In the family, the one that I showed you in the center was the final approved print that they ran off in an edition. I'd have to look back to see the actual number of that edition. So the ones around it were all unique images as he was developing that final image.
Karen, it's Natalie again. I have a vague
Yeah.
memory that he spoke at Hofstra.
Yes, he did, and I'm sorry to say I don't have the date. It was probably in the early 80s, but I'd have to find out for you, Natalie. He did come to Hofstra.
I think I have a poster from that, which is
well, he came. I think it was the time when they were doing the New Opportunities at Hofstra, the NOAA program.
Mhm.
because he did, one of his works is on that poster.
Yes.
So I kind of think it was related to that. I'd have to go look up specifically when that was. But I think that,
My memory was right then.
yes, I think you're correct. Yes. I did not look that up. I can find that out and let you know. But I know that his image is on the NOAA poster.
Right.
So I'm assuming that NOAA was a program, it still is a program called New Opportunities at Hofstra. It was for local students who maybe didn't, who had the aptitude, but maybe not the testing numbers to get, so they would bring them in and give them additional help and resources to start at college.
And economically deprived, it was large.
Yeah. But it was a program to kind of, expand who was accepted by giving them, they maybe showed a certain aptitude and intelligence, but maybe they didn't test as well, different aspects like that. So, yeah. So, anything else? Anybody else has?
No other questions in the chat, Karen.
Okay. All right. So I'm just going to actually tell you that we actually are having some of our African masks and works on exhibition opening next week in our David Filderman Gallery is Art of the Dogon. The Dogon are a people based primarily in Mali. And we have a selection, I think there's about 30 works on view, figures, masks, doors, and some jewelry and bracelets that are included. So you're certainly welcome to come to see that. We think that's a nice connection with Romare because African work was something that he studied and knew. And I just want to remind you, next week we're going to talk about the different influences and themes. And this is the one I was referring when you talk about Caribbean colors. I think this one just shows you the influence of those Caribbean colors on his work, as he was spending about half the year down in the Caribbean in St. Martin and then coming back to New York. But I think the colors on these just are really striking for that reason. But we'll talk more about specific works in the collection, some of the iconography, how they were made, give you a little bit more in depth about that. I think that was it. Yep. So just if you have questions, feel free to email us. You can also follow us, if you follow us on social media, we always do updates about what we're doing. You can visit our museum webpage. We also, on the calendar page, has all of our events and exhibitions listed if you want to know what dates things are happening. If anybody has any specific questions, if we can ask about anything else in general, we can answer those. I thank you all for joining us.
Sharon, good question. Can speak about other artists who had similar acclaim as Bearden at the time. Is it fair to ask, what was his relationship to the artist Jacob Lawrence?
Oh, they were, what do you call? They were mutual. I mean, they were friends. I mean, there was a mutual relationship there. They were both very concerned about. They wanted not only to address their own personal experience, but they wanted to bring the life of the daily kind of everyday life of Black Americans to light. I mean, that's part of what they did. Their work can be similar in some ways. They use a lot of the similar themes because they talk about daily life. They talk about I'm trying to think of this series. I'm sorry, but I think that they really wanted to, and while they were promoting themselves, they were also promoting a larger body of people, a larger body of artists. But he was definitely. But around that same time, if you want to talk about, I mean, in the post World War I, I'm just going to give you some general info. I'll go back to that because that's a nicer slide. I mean, post World War II, the center of the art world moves to New York City after Paris. Pre World War II, pretty much the art world was centered in Paris. This is very sweeping generalization, so don't quote me. And then World War II, it really moves to New York City. A lot because a lot of the European artists moved to the New York area before and during World War II. So a lot of the artists were moving, European artists were moving to New York. New York, you know, in the 1950s and 60s, that's when you have Jackson Pollock and abstract expressionism. There's a lot of push towards greater use of abstraction. You have and less focus on figurative work. Bearden and actually Lawrence also were very much interested in the figure and man, and so that they didn't fit into some of those more abstract movements that were happening. After abstract expressionism, there's a couple different other movements that come on. Minimalism and pop art come up at that time. So he was seeing all this going around him. And sometimes you can see different aspects of some of those other movements in his work. Because, you know, Bearden was somebody who was very, very well educated, came from a very educated family. He certainly knew art history. He certainly traveled a lot. He was not, it wasn't like he was you know, he had artistic training, formal training. He wasn't somebody who kind of made it up himself. He did have training, and then he went back and said, well, how do I use this myself to express what I want to do? So I think that if that helps to give him a little bit more of a place.
Both of them, Lawrence and Bearden, used the Great Migration of Blacks in their paintings. I mean, that's another similarity.
Yeah, they have. That's actually the one I was thinking of, Natalie, because we had shown a number of years ago the Jacob Lawrence Great Migration series in the gallery a number of years ago. We don't own it; it was on loan, but yeah. But they're very much concerned. They very much wanted to present their own experience, and I think that, you know, they weren't the only ones who did that, but that was definitely a connection between the two. Was there anything else, Sasha? Or is that?
No, just a lot of thank yous, a lot of good responses. So thank you to everyone. It's good to see all the comments coming in, but no more questions.
Okay, good. Well, I thank you all for coming to this first session. I hope it gives you a little taste of what's to come, and that you'll come back next week and look at. You got something else for me,
yes,
Sasha?
Yes, one more good question from Jane. I think you mentioned Giotto in part with Matisse and Picasso.
Yeah.
In a sentence, is this the early Giotto, and how does that fit in?
Yes, it's referring to the, how would you say?
Proto-Renaissance.
Pre-Renaissance, proto-Renaissance. Yeah, I was exactly how to categorize that. But as I was saying, you know, Bearden was somebody who studied art history. He knew, you know, and he spent time when he was in Paris. He traveled and he went to museums and he went and he looked. So he had a lot of different influences. And I think with Giotto, I think some of it is in the way he kind of the flatness of his picture plane. I mean, there's some things that are very similar. I don't think there's like a direct thing where he copied, you know. I mean, I think he looked at a lot, you know. And when you look at a lot of art, you kind of start to assimilate the things that you want to take from something. So I don't think you necessarily like copying things, but the use of
Can I add one thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say too, with Giotto, that he was a painter before perspective, right? So his artwork is very flat, and it doesn't have like that real rendered perspective. So that, like Matisse, like Picasso, they're working with kind of not that realistic linear perspective.
Yeah. So, and I think if anybody is familiar with Matisse, especially his later work, his paper cutouts, and he did a series called Jazz, the way that Bearden is handling the figures in this particular print from the Odysseus suite is very similar to the way Matisse did. The way they're almost just a shape cut out. That's very similar to Matisse. It's not exact, but it's very similar the way he's done it. So I think that there, you know, as I was saying, when you look at a lot of different artists and you see, oh, I like the way he did this. I like the way he handled this. Maybe I'll try to incorporate that. I think, you know, because as I said, Bearden looked at a lot, and he knew when he was in Paris, he hung out with the artists. He went to their studios. He was working himself as a student at the Sorbonne. You know, so he was in part of that whole group of artists there. So that was very, you know, he was not somebody who was kind of like an outsider artist coming in. He was somebody who was involved in the study of art and thought it was important and thought it was something that you should do as an artist. So thank you all for joining us. I really appreciate it, you coming and joining us for this. And as I said, next week, we're going to talk more specifically about specific artworks and some of the influences. I'll show you some of those details about those prints that have the notes on them and things like that. It's the same, as I mentioned, it's the same Zoom link, and I will send out Friday morning. I'll send out a little reminder email with the link on it, so you don't have to worry about losing the link. And certainly, if you have any questions in the meantime, you can always email us. You just email back. If you email back on that Zoom link, you'll get me. So, so I'm going to stop my sharing. So I just thank you all, and it's good to see some familiar faces and a lot of new faces too. So I'm happy to, yeah, happy that you joined us.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
As long as you don't call us old faces.
Some familiar faces and some new faces too.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Your lectures are always so interesting.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you.